My name is Danielle Harlow. I'm 36 years old, and I serve as a linguistics intelligence officer at Fort Gordon. For most of my career, I've lived in the shadows intentionally, quietly, and with purpose. I never wore ribbons on my uniform, never asked to sit in the front row. I didn't need to, because I was there when it mattered most. The auditorium was packed. You could smell the starch in every uniform. The shine on every shoe reflected the fluorescent lights above. But all I could hear was my father's voice, sharp, dismissive, echoing through 3 rows ahead of me. No soldier needs Arabic, Pashto, or Farsi. He scoffed just as the master of ceremony mentioned linguistic intelligence in the context of covert missions. His tone was loud, careless, designed to be overheard. My brother chuckled and leaned sideways to whisper into his shoulder. Middle Eastern dialects are pointless. That's civilian stuff. Real soldiers don't sit behind translators. Their words didn't sting. Not anymore. I'd heard versions of them at every family gathering. What hurt was the smugness, the certainty that they were right, that their world had no room for my kind of war. I stood behind them. No nameplate, no special uniform, just 3 rows back in standard issue black and olive. I was meant to be invisible, but I heard everything. I always did. The MC cleared his throat, shifting from the general commendations into the confidential files. His voice lowered in tone, but rose in gravity. There are operations we cannot name, missions that never made headlines, but they succeeded because someone spoke, and someone else listened. Silence swept through the hall. The master sergeant whispered into the Admiral's ear. Then in a tone that cut like steel, the Admiral stepped forward. "We need Aquila 7 in the room," he said plainly. Chairs creaked, heads turned. I stepped forward. No ribbons, no medal, no introduction. Just me and the sound of every boot rising to attention. People stood, not because they knew me, but because someone in power did. My father rose last, slower than everyone else. I didn't need to look to know his mouth was slightly open, caught mid-breath. I didn't need to see him freeze in place to know he did. The Admiral didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply said, "You spoke when we needed silence broken. And every time you did, a unit came home." I stood still. My code name was all that was offered. Aquila 7. That was enough. Because it meant I was the reason some families weren't burying their sons. It meant my whispers across encrypted lines had meant more than screams on battlefields. And for the first time in front of a crowd, I didn't need to hide, but I said nothing. My father shifted his weight. My brother blinked. And I listened again, this time to the sound of their certainty unraveling. When I was 7, I thought foreign languages lived inside objects. Not books, not classrooms, just objects. The shampoo bottle with Persian script in the back of our bathroom cabinet. The dented metal box of jasmine tea from a neighbor's garage sale with letters I later learned were Urdu. The warning sticker on Dad's rusted toolbox, which said something in what I would come to recognize as Hebrew. Nobody taught me. Nobody asked me to learn. Mom had lost her voice literally. A rare illness had slowly erased her speech, and now she only communicated through short notes scribbled on index cards or quiet gestures. She smiled with her eyes, but her silence filled the house. Dad filled the rest with noise. Not conversation, just shouting, commands, barked orders about chores, curfews, or the state of the kitchen sink. He didn't speak to me. He spoke at me. That made words precious, sacred, something I collected, hoarded like a secret. My first love was Farsi. I didn't know the name back then. All I knew was that a certain brand of laundry detergent had instructions printed in what looked like elegant swirls and loops beneath the English. I sat for hours trying to match the script to the motions Mom used while doing laundry. Over time, the loops began to mean something. Then came Arabic through the voice of a battered radio. Dad brought it home from a military surplus auction. It had dust in every crevice, and only played one station crackling through static. Sometimes I'd hear prayers, sometimes songs. Sometimes just men speaking calmly but firmly, like they were narrating something important. I didn't understand it at first, but the rhythm pulled me in. I started mimicking the sounds out loud, shaping them with my mouth, until they felt familiar. Languages became my lullaby, my secret garden. And then came Hebrew. I had seen it in fragments on packaging, old books in the school library. even the inside of a second-hand jacket. But it wasn't until I spoke it aloud at the dinner table that it became something else. I still remember that night, a Friday. I had memorized a short line from a children's story written in Hebrew. I was proud. I thought Dad would be impressed. I waited for the moment. He was quiet for once, distracted by a news segment on the TV behind me. I recited the line softly, more to myself than to anyone. He didn't even look up. Just said flat and cold, "Say it again and you'll do push-ups." I was stunned. I hadn't been trying to be disrespectful. I hadn't been trying to be anything at all except curious, alive. He saw it differently. In his world, languages were threats. Otherness was disobedience. He didn't like what he couldn't control. I didn't speak Hebrew out loud again for a year, but I didn't stop learning. By the time I was 10, I could distinguish between Levantine and Gulf dialects of Arabic just by listening to a sentence. I could read simple paragraphs in Farsi. I understood the cadence of Hebrew even when the letters blurred. Language had become a kind of armor, soft and visible, and mine. Mom noticed, though. She never said a word. She would slip me foreign newspapers from the recycling bin or leave out international recipe books she found at the thrift store. Once she gave me a magazine with half the pages written in French. It had a sticky note attached that simply read, "You might like page 12. I memorized every word on that page, even the ads. Language gave me what my home could not: connection, meaning, identity. It gave me power even when no one saw it yet. It was the language no one heard, but I was listening, always. And one day, the world would too. My name is Danielle Harlow, and I remember the day I walked into the Pashto language exam at West Point like it happened this morning. Not because it was difficult, but because of the way people looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong building. I had tested out of beginner and intermediate levels in record time. My professors, though skeptical at first, couldn't deny the results. When Colonel Dyer, who oversaw the linguistic evaluation program, read the first few questions aloud, I answered before he could finish. "You studied under someone from Kandahar?" he asked, brows furrowing. "No, sir," I replied. "I studied with a shortwave radio and a map." I could tell he didn't know whether to laugh or be impressed. "Your accent, it's distinctly southern Afghanistan." "Border dialect, I noticed," I said softly. That's when I heard the chuckle behind me. Then a low voice, sharp, amused, and full of condescension, cut through the stillness of the classroom. "Trying to flirt with the enemy, Harlow." The voice belonged to James Cutter, a third-generation infantry brat, with more medals in his family than books on his shelf. He had barely passed Spanish 2 the previous semester. I didn't answer him. I didn't look back. Instead, I glanced at the test sheet again, memorizing not just the vocabulary, but the spacing, the formatting, the shape of the symbols on the edge of the page. My brain didn't just learn languages, it absorbed the code behind the words. I marked the final question with calm precision and stood up. Colonel Dyer motioned for me to wait. He glanced at my answer sheet and blinked rapidly. "This is Harlow. How do you know these idiomatic expressions?" I hesitated. "They're usually used by insurgents when they shift routes or change drop points. I heard them in call intercepts online." He blinked again. "You intercepted encrypted traffic." "No, sir, public channels, old ones, forgotten but still active." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, dismissed. That night I lay in my dorm bunk, staring at the ceiling, my mind restless despite my exhaustion. I kept replaying the exam. Not the questions, those were easy. It was that sneer in Cutter's voice. That assumption. That laughter. My mind drifted, as it often did, into dreams coded like puzzles. That night I dreamt I was in a desert safe house, listening through an old Russian-made receiver. A voice, breathy, urgent, whispered in Arabic mixed with Dari. "The package moves at dusk. Change route. Same signal. 2 guards." I woke up gasping. I wrote it all down, every phrase, every pause, every inflection. Then I translated it 3 different ways: literal, idiomatic, strategic. And when I showed it to my intelligence professor the next day, he glanced up at me slowly, like I'd handed him something radioactive. "Where did you get this?" "I dreamt it," I replied. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He just said, "Keep dreaming." Later that week, during a simulation drill, I was placed in a communications tent with Cutter and 2 others. Our objective was simple: intercept a coded message and determine its location. Cutter rolled his eyes. "This is just a glorified crossword," I kept quiet. The message came through at 02:43 hours. Cutter read it aloud. Red songbird leaves at night. Guarded sky. He tossed the paper aside. Nonsense. I picked it up. It's not nonsense. Songbird means asset. Guarded sky refers to drone surveillance. They're trying to extract someone through mountainous terrain. The room fell silent. What do you think, Harlow? Our sergeant asked. I think they'll exit through Wakan corridor. There's cloud cover tonight. If we don't redirect now, they're gone by sunrise. He relayed my theory up the chain. Hours later, command confirmed a high-value target had attempted an escape through the same corridor. Thanks to the redirect we intercepted. They didn't tell the press. They never do. But Cutter never joked again, not to me. He just looked at me sideways, like I was a creature he couldn't categorize. I wasn't offended. I understood. Because when people can't define what you are, they either mock you or fear you. And in my case, they eventually needed me more than they liked admitting. That year I started keeping journals coded, annotated, multilingual. Every dream, every overheard phrase, every instinct went into those pages. Because I knew something they didn't. Languages are more than communication. They're pattern, rhythm, heartbeat. And when you hear the pulse of a region, you hear the fear before it's spoken. The betrayal before it's committed. The ambush before it's triggered. West Point gave me the uniform, but languages, they gave me vision. And I would learn to use that vision to save lives without ever needing to fire a weapon or raise my voice. Only my code name. And eventually, that would be enough to stop wars before they started. Even if my father never heard a word of it. When I received the full-ride ROTC scholarship, I thought for one fleeting second that maybe, just maybe, he'd say something kind. Something resembling pride. It had taken me months to design that linguistic mapping system. I'd spent my winter break collecting field samples of speech patterns from online broadcasts, local calls intercepted through public archives, and listening to every podcast I could find in Dari Farsi Pashto. I had color-coded pitch variations, tone shifts, and borrowed lexical items to detect fake accents, an indicator often overlooked in counterintelligence. The judges had called it a pioneering approach to enemy impersonation detection. And so with trembling hands, I walked into the kitchen, the envelope warm from my grip. My father was at the counter scribbling down a grocery list. His black military watch caught the light. "Dad," I said, I got this today." He didn't turn around. I slid the envelope onto the table beside his notepad. He glanced at it briefly, his eyes moved over the government seal, the weight of the envelope, the return address. His face didn't change. Then slowly he folded it in half without opening it and set it aside, right next to the shopping list. "Don't forget to buy milk," he muttered. I stood there, the hum of the refrigerator louder than it should have been. From behind me, Evan chuckled. "That thing looks like a CIA file. All that work, and you don't even get to shoot anyone." He picked up the envelope and flapped it like a fan. "Where's the fun in speaking alphabet soup?" I didn't respond. I just nodded quietly. Took the letter back and walked toward the hallway. My room was still filled with books stacked like bricks around my mattress. Some in Arabic, others in Urdu, a few in old-school Russian. It had become my own little bunker of silence. At dinner that evening, no one mentioned the scholarship. My father asked Evan about his pull-up stats. Evan boasted about his latest target practice scores. Mom remained silent as usual. As I cleared the dishes, I thought, maybe I'll never be enough here. Not unless I break something, or shoot something, or shout louder than I speak. But I didn't want that kind of recognition. I wanted them to notice how many lives could be saved, not taken, because someone understood a whispered phrase in the right dialect at the right time. The next day I overheard Dad talking to one of his old buddies on the phone. "She's going to be chasing phantom accents overseas," he scoffed. No spine for the field, but plenty of time for crossword puzzles in Urdu. It was always like that. Echoes in our house weren't from the structure, they were from the things left unsaid, the dismissals that hung in the air like fog. I knew he had a narrow view of service combat gunpowder bodies. Languages, emotions, empathy, soft. The weekend after I left the house earlier than usual, took the long route to the library downtown and asked for access to their historical linguistic archive. The librarian, a retired Afghan woman named Zara, noticed my accent as I read aloud a fragment of a 1973 Pashto poem. You're not from Kandahar, she smiled. But you speak like someone who's been there. I didn't tell her that I had never left the state. That my only window to those lands was through old documentaries, cracked audio files, and talking to janitors and cooks at West Point, who were always shocked that a cadet wanted to hear their stories. I stayed at that library for 6 hours, reading, recording, retranslating. That night, I compiled a small booklet, my own code book on how to differentiate propaganda speech from sincere dialect. The goal helps soldiers identify enemy plants and villages using just the way they greet a child or bless a meal. I submitted it anonymously to an ROTC adjunct I admired. He emailed me 3 days later. Whoever you are, brilliant work. Let's talk. I didn't tell my family. By then I had learned that silence was less disappointing than indifference. A week later, that same adjunct asked me to join a closed trial program involving crypto-linguistic application in Middle Eastern operations. I signed on immediately. During the first session, a young recruit turned to me and whispered, "Why do you even care about this stuff?" I said nothing. Instead, I played a clip. A 7-second recording I'd pulled from a radio broadcast barely audible in thick Kosti Pashto. I've walked past the Red House twice. There are children inside. To an untrained ear, it was nonsense. To me, it was code. That message had preceded an ambush 6 years ago. But in this simulation, the system caught it. Because I translated it right. When the screen blinked green, the room fell silent. That, I said, is why I care. I kept the printout of my scholarship acceptance folded in my uniform pocket for the rest of that year. Not for pride, but as proof. Not for them, but for me. I didn't need a frame on the wall. I just needed one person to listen, and one day, maybe they would. I remember the dry wind in Ramadi like it was yesterday. It had a sound to it low, constant, like the whisper of something ancient trying to speak again. We were stationed near an old training post repurposed into a forward operating base, but barely more than sandbags and sweat. One evening just before sunset, our intel unit intercepted an audio recording. The file was rough, lots of static background market chatter and dialect I hadn't heard in years, but my ears caught the rhythm. It wasn't standard Arabic. It wasn't even the Pashto I had memorized at West Point. No, this was Yemeni Arabic, a pre-modern dialect with tribal cadence. I recognized it from a half-burned cassette I once found in an old language archive. As the team played the tape over the comms speaker, a younger officer, Lieutenant Carver, new boots, still too clean, laughed. "We already got Google Translate. What's the point of all that fancy ear training?" He was met with chuckles. I said nothing, but I was already writing left to right to left, capturing the threats hidden between honorifics and coded references to fathers of the crescent. 10 minutes passed. I had the translation, and it wasn't good. اسمع، لا تقتربوا من الممر الشرقي. هناك مفاجآت تنتظركم. الموت قادم مع الريح، لا تتبعوه. الكلاب في الخارج، والليل يغني لهم. ابقوا مختبئين حتى تسمعوا الطائر يصيح 3 مرات. ثم تحركوا، لكن لا تخطئوا. الكلمة الأخيرة ستكون لنا. They were planning a coordinated strike on a civilian medical center. Worse, the voice named a known contact, someone our intel marked as low risk. I turned to our captain. "Sir, this isn't just chatter. They're setting a convergence point northeast of us, exact coordinates, match the market route for aid deliveries." He raised an eyebrow. "You sure they're using archaic phrasing to mask it?" "But yes. There's a phrase, 'The hand that pours sugar will see the flames first.' It's tribal warning code." He studied me for a second, then gave the call. "Scramble the drone. Cross-verify those coordinates." 8 minutes later, the drone feed picked up 2 trucks tarp-covered parked beside what looked like an empty stall. I saw one man lift the tarp-shaped charges. The order to strike came quickly. I didn't watch the feed. I didn't need to. The captain didn't make a speech. He simply walked over to me and said, "Keep that earpiece on. You're our early warning." That night there was no celebration, no medals, no names on the board. But I knew we'd saved lives. Maybe dozens, maybe more. Still, when the official report circulated, the entry read, "Intercepted chatter led to disruption of hostile supply point." No names, no notes on dialect. No mention of who understood it. Back in the mess hall later that week, Carver avoided eye contact. But I caught him staring at my notebook once. He didn't say anything. The silence in Ramadi taught me more than any classroom. The way language lives beneath the surface. The way listening becomes survival. The way invisibility can be a kind of shield but also a burden. Some nights I would sit on the rooftop radio on one side, tea on the other, and I'd repeat those dialects in my mind like prayers. Farsi, Pashto, Arabic, even some old Dari. Sometimes I'd whisper them out loud to the stars as if the sky could carry the syllables to someone else who might need them. But back home I knew none of it would matter. My father still believed war was muscle and maps. My brother still thought I was the family translator who never fired a weapon. And me, I was learning that not every victory left visible scars. Some were silent, some were sand. I didn't notice it at first. The first report came back from the Ramadi operation crisp and formal as expected. It mentioned the intercepted audio. It credited the translation, but there was no name, not even Aquila 7. Just translated by linguistics support team. I thought it was a clerical oversight. It happened. But then came the second report. This time the audio file had been retagged. The timestamp was altered by exactly 3 minutes. That small change could have made a huge difference because 3 minutes earlier, the original file contained a phrase indicating a second target. A warning. Without it, the operation's success looked incomplete, almost lucky. I ran the original file through my personal archive, something I kept synced and encrypted outside the main system. It still had the original timestamp. But in the official network, the revised version was the only one accessible. I didn't raise it. I took screenshots. I started logging changes. Every report, every file touched. Then came the third sign. A mission was assigned in Al-Karma. It wasn't mine. I wasn't on the team. But the prep briefing circulated through the secure channel what we called gold ribbon, because of the color-coded threat levels. And in that file, I saw it. Aquila 7, my code name, attached to a mission team I wasn't part of. Target zone, an unstable checkpoint known for IED activity. Civilian presence, no language unit on site. No one to identify tribal markers. No one who could tell a wedding procession from a smuggling route. I flagged it to my section chief. He brushed it off, probably a template error. We copy and paste code names sometimes, Danielle. It's procedural. I nodded. But something inside me didn't sit right. A week later, the Al-Karma op went south. A fire team walked into a misidentified civilian area. 2 injured, 1 evac. The after-action report blamed unreliable intel. No mention of linguistics. No mention of me. No one asked me why my code name was attached. It would have been easy to ignore, easy to focus on the next assignment. But the pattern kept growing. I found 3 more instances where Aquila 7 was listed in briefing packets for operations I never attended. 2 involved disputed translations that led to compromised entry points. 1 had no linguist listed at all in the final report, just a redacted comment that read, "Asset unconfirmed." Asset, not officer, not interpreter, not human, just asset. Something was wrong. I stopped asking questions. I started documenting. Quietly, methodically. I archived file hashes, metadata, message logs. I noted which names disappeared from reports, mine and a few others. Usually women, usually support roles, usually invisible. I stayed late at comms. I pulled backup server logs. I rerouted copies of debrief files to a hidden archive built into my personal gear. I memorized the structure of every directory I touched. I became a ghost among ghosts. One night, while cross-checking reports from Kandahar, I saw it again, my code name tagged to a field op 2 continents away. I had never left Kuwait that week. But the op failed. And in its failure, I was the invisible scapegoat. The phantom name impossible to trace, convenient to blame. I didn't confront anyone. I couldn't. Because by then I had understood something deeper. Someone wanted Aquila 7 erased, not publicly disgraced, not demoted, just deleted. Like I had never been there. No recognition meant no responsibility. No record meant no accountability. They weren't just rewriting history. They were making sure I wouldn't survive it on paper or in memory. That's when I stopped sleeping. I started rotating bunk assignments. I shut off my GPS locator in the internal network. I kept a manual notebook with 3 layers of cipher. I stored names, faces, patterns. I drew lines between officers who shared initials on altered files. I tracked login times and mirrored user IDs. It wasn't paranoia, it was math. Statistical frequency, pattern deviation, operational anomalies. Someone was burying me byte by byte, mission by mission. And if I disappeared, no one would even know what part of the war I had lived through. But I knew, and I would make sure someone else did too one day. Even if I had to code my legacy into a language no one else knew how to read. It was just supposed to be a routine diagnostic. A log sweep. Nothing covert, nothing urgent. I was checking redundancy systems at the base's communication node in Mosul, double verifying data handoff after a network hiccup the night before. SOP. Every comm officer had to do it once per rotation. But deep in the server audit trail, I found a strange pattern. There was a ghost login, someone using internal access credentials, at an unusual hour 2:48 a.m. local. The user ID was masked, but the activity pinged a buried folder in the archive I had helped organize 6 months earlier, encrypted field transcripts, Western Border region, Farsi and Kurmanji streams. I paused. That folder wasn't part of any current briefings. No operational teams had requested decryption logs from it in over a month. I knew because I monitored all retrievals tagged with high-sensitivity dialects. Yet this login had accessed 3 specific files from that folder. Files I had translated personally, recordings from a roadside exchange near Tel Afar, where smugglers used coded idioms to describe IED placements. I reopened the file access trail. Someone had pulled the Farsi transcript, extracted 2 sections, then 20 minutes later accessed the Northern Iraq Situation Report draft for Sector D7. It was the timing that caught me. The sitrep had been finalized 2 days ago. So why reopen it? Why now? Out of habit, I clicked into the draft version stored in the temp folder and ran a quick comparison with the final signed document submitted by Field Command. Just a basic text diff. One paragraph stood out. The sitrep claimed local informants had confirmed safe passage through the El Barak corridor with no irregular activity reported in the past week. But that wasn't what the transcript said. My original translation clearly flagged a shift in smuggler activity, phrases like birds rerouting east before the rain, and gifts waiting where the ground is soft, standard idioms for hidden movement and explosive placement. The corridor wasn't safe. It was heating up. Someone had rewritten my report, and the altered version got pushed up the chain. The next day we lost Sergeant Molina. He died on patrol route El Barak. His Humvee hit an IED buried along the bend. The incident was recorded as unanticipated hostile escalation. But it wasn't unanticipated. Not if anyone had actually read what I submitted. My hands shook as I pulled up the masked user's IP log. I triangulated the internal terminal used. The location code pinged the east wing of our base. The Intel Division workstations. 3 assigned officers used that node during off hours. One of them was Evan, my brother. I stared at the screen, frozen. It didn't make sense. Evan wasn't a linguist. He had clearance, sure, but not for Farsi or Kurmanji materials. He shouldn't even have been able to enter that folder unless he had help or a bypass key. Unless he had been using his access for shortcuts. He was part of the team compiling regional intel packages, responsible for condensing multi-source data into summaries for operational planning. I'd always wondered how quickly his briefs came together, how he always beat his deadlines, how he always had just enough information to shine without being questioned. Now I knew. He'd lifted my translations, skimmed enough to pad his reports. But this time, he hadn't understood the layered dialects, the idioms. He'd misinterpreted or ignored what I flagged. And someone paid for it. I wanted to storm across the base and scream in his face. Ask him how he could take work he didn't understand and turn it into lies. Ask if he knew what his efficiency had cost. But I didn't, because I already knew how he'd respond. He'd laugh, shrug, call it a gray area. Say, "It's not like you own the language, Danny." He'd quote Dad, something cold, something practical, collateral happens. So instead I made a copy. I pulled the original file, my unedited transcript, and attached the full audio log. I inserted it into a newly created report titled Discrepancy in Region D7 Translation for internal audit. I left out my name. I removed all metadata that could link it to me. I rerouted it to an internal quality control inbox, a compartmentalized third-party office that reviewed flagged inconsistencies across translation divisions. No one ever replied. No one needed to. Just receiving it was enough to start an internal inquiry. I didn't need a trial. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the truth on the record. I sat there in that cold communications bay, staring at the flickering terminal light. I thought of Sergeant Molina's boots, his laugh, the crumpled coffee packets he left in every debrief room, and I whispered quietly like a prayer through teeth clenched with rage. They buried you with a lie, but someone should at least say your name. I logged off. Then I walked out into the desert air and didn't look back. My father laughed again. That low, familiar scoff from the third row, barely audible to most but ringing in my ears like a whip crack. It was the same sound he used when I'd pronounced something in Farsi at the dinner table. The same laugh that followed me from the sandbox to West Point. Evan leaned in behind him and whispered, just loud enough. She's probably here to collect ribbons for listening, not leading. Someone chuckled. Someone else cleared their throat. Polite discomfort rippled through the chairs like a quiet wind across polished uniforms. I stood in the aisle. The auditorium still smelled like polished wood and paper programs. The screen behind Admiral Grayson projected a slide, recognition of service, strategic intel division. My name wasn't on it. Not yet. Admiral Grayson stepped forward to the podium. He had the kind of voice that didn't need a microphone, but used one anyway to make sure no syllable was missed. His hands rested on the lectern, like he had all the time in the world. And then he said it. We need Aquila 7. The room froze. I walked forward. Not rushed. Not slow. Just steady measured like I had practiced every morning in my boots pacing the courtyard when no one was awake. As I reached the stage, I didn't glance at Evan, or at Dad, or at anyone really. I was listening. Like I always did. Admiral Grayson didn't look at me right away. He looked out at the crowd. He waited for silence to settle, not just into the room, but into the bones of every person seated. Then he began. In 2019, near Ramadi, an intercepted broadcast referenced the mouth between stones. No one understood it. No one except Aquila 7. He turned toward me now. Because of her work, her understanding of dialects, most of us will never even hear spoken aloud a convoy rerouted. No casualties. Mission successful. He clicked a button. A map appeared. In Al-Rila, she decrypted a phrase mistranslated 3 times by AI, where old winds hide teeth. She recognized it as a coded location for concealed drones. Because of her, a forward base held its ground. There were murmurs, a few heads turned. I stood straight. My dress uniform was perfectly pressed. My ribbons aligned my boots silent. I said nothing. In Syria, Admiral Grayson continued an embedded phrase in Yemeni Arabic, warned of an ambush disguised as a wedding procession. No one else flagged it. Aquila 7 did, and 37 lives were spared. He paused. This operative, this soldier, has operated in the shadows, unseen, often unnamed. Then he looked down at his script, but didn't read it. He folded the paper in half and let it rest beside the microphone. Today we don't call her specialist or analyst. Today we call her what she earned. Captain Danielle Harlow stepped forward. My feet moved, but my chest felt tight. I wasn't used to this kind of space. Spotlights were for people who made noise. I translated noise. I interpreted silence. But I stepped forward. إذا عبروا النهر مع الصباح فافتحوا العيون عند الغروب. الطفل في القارب ليس وحده. هناك طير يحوم فوق الهدف ينتظر من يوقظه. لكن النسر لا يصيح إن كانت الأرض خرساء. انتبهوا للصمت. Admiral Grayson pinned the insignia carefully, his fingers steady. As he stepped back, he didn't salute yet. He nodded first. Then, clean sharp, he raised his hand in full salute. Others followed, row by row, officer by officer, uniforms rising like a wave. And in the third row, Dad sat stiff. His eyes didn't blink, his mouth pressed shut. The smug curve was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, something like confusion wrapped in regret. Evan turned his head slightly, as if hoping someone would explain what just happened. No one did, because they weren't the ones who needed to understand. I was, and I did. I understood that this moment wasn't for them. It wasn't even for me. It was for every voice I had translated that would never stand on a podium. For every ancient word no machine could learn. For every soldier who got to go home because I heard something the world chose not to hear. As the applause broke out loud and full, I didn't flinch, because I knew this was just the beginning. Not of being seen, but of making what I saw matter. My name was never called again that day. Not from my family, not from anyone in that third row. But the moment Admiral Grayson stepped back, having saluted me with the full weight of his rank, something shifted in the air. It was heavier than silence, denser than ceremony. It was truth. My father sat motionless for a full second. Then slowly, painfully, as if rising, cost him something more than pride, he stood. He didn't clap, he didn't smile, he didn't even look at me directly. He stood like a man trying to remember if this moment was real or a punishment. His hands were clenched at his sides, white-knuckled. For the first time in my life, I saw him uncertain, unarmed, unmasked. Next to him, Evan kept his eyes down. He didn't move, not even to acknowledge Dad. The same man who once asked why I wasted time with backward languages. The same brother who laughed at every dialect I mastered. Neither had words now, not one. But they didn't need to speak. Because every officer in that room had already spoken in how they rose, how they saluted, how they looked at me as I stood still at center stage. They saw me, not as someone's daughter, not as a whisperer of foreign things, but as a soldier who had been on the front lines even when the map said otherwise, as someone who heard before others even thought to listen. I didn't smile, I didn't bow, I didn't look back at them. I took 3 steps forward and stood at the center. No podium, no speech, just a woman who had been asked to show up. That was my whole life, really. Showing up when no one else could hear the warning, when the data didn't make sense, when the voice behind the static needed translation, not interpretation. No medal was pinned to my chest. No fanfare followed the applause. And that was perfect. Because recognition, the kind that matters, isn't about ceremony. It's about knowing you did something when no one believed you could. It's about knowing the silence that surrounds you isn't emptiness, it's earned quiet. The kind only those who've stood at the edge understand. And right now, I stood in that quiet. Admiral Grayson stepped to the side, giving me space, but not leaving. I could feel the weight of his presence just behind me, steady like a mountain. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the ripple in the audience. One of the younger officers leaned to whisper, and his commanding officer nudged him to silence. Not because whispers weren't allowed, but because this moment didn't deserve commentary. It deserved gravity. Behind me, the slide was still glowing faintly with the name Aquila 7. A name most of the people in the room had only read in reports. A name that didn't have a face until now. Until I stood where I was told to. Until I let them see me not as the ghost behind the intel, but as the person who lived inside every overlooked transmission. My father's body was still tense. I could see it in the way his shoulders rose. His jaw ticked. But he didn't sit back down. He just stood there. For the first time, he didn't try to interrupt the room with his presence. He didn't insert himself. He didn't scoff or speak or control. He froze. And Evan couldn't even fake composure. His head remained low, his hands clasped. All those years of snide remarks of smug superiority over real combat versus desk intelligence collapsed under one truth. Every mission I touched came home, and theirs didn't always. I never needed to shout that fact. I never had to prove anything. I just did the work. In silence. In shadows. In languages they said weren't useful. That's the part that stung the most for them, I think. That it wasn't vengeance. It wasn't spite. It wasn't rebellion. It was purpose. Purpose doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't need validation. It just keeps showing up. So I stood there, letting the moment breathe. I didn't need the microphone. I didn't need a list of names or citations. I let the silence speak for me. I let every life saved in Syria, every ambush avoided in Ramadi, every misinterpreted phrase I corrected, I let all of it echo louder than applause. The Admiral nodded again. Brief, measured. Then he returned to the microphone, not to replace me, but to close the moment. That will conclude this portion of the ceremony. Just that. No embellishment. Just an end as precise as the work I had always done. And as I turned and walked off stage past the rows of those who had risen, I didn't seek eyes. I didn't search for pride in my father's face or apology in Evan's. Because this wasn't their moment of realization, it was mine. It always had been. The sound of ice clinking in a tumbler was the first thing I noticed. That and the hush that always settles when someone walks in who doesn't belong or wasn't expected. I stepped into the officer's lounge out of habit, not invitation. A habit formed by years of never needing permission, yet knowing every threshold I crossed would come with whispers behind it. The door clicked shut behind me, and I heard it soft, almost playful. "She's just a translator." I didn't flinch. Someone else let out a quiet scoff. Another voice responded smugly, amused, "Ghost name." Sounds like branding. There it was. They hadn't expected Aquila 7 to be a woman, let alone someone who wore no medals, gave no speech, and walked like she didn't need either. I walked past them slow and even toward the far end of the lounge, where the coffee station sat half full, lukewarm, just the way I liked it. The room was still dressed in uniforms and stiff collars, but the tone had shifted from celebration to post-game analysis. Now it was about sorting out what they'd seen, or rather what they'd misjudged. As I stirred my cup, I caught the glance of one Lieutenant Young, eyes sharp. He looked down almost instantly. Another chuckled nervously behind me. I mean, intelligence gets flashy too, I guess. Still no one said anything to me directly. Still no one dared. And then I heard it. A voice with the weight of memory spoken with just enough steel to cut through the murmurs. "She's the one who caught the false neutral in Alpha Male." The room stilled. I turned slightly, just enough to see the speaker. Major Leland. Recon Division. I remembered him. He'd been the one who brought in that suspicious convoy from Alpha Male and nearly greenlit it as friendly. The dialect was tricky old Najdi with borrowed phrases from a long-dead tribal tongue. The kind that could make one phrase sound like clear passage instead of ready strike. I'd flagged it within 7 minutes. The raid team had pulled back just in time. Leland met my gaze now. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just stated the fact again, this time more slowly so no one could mistake it for praise. "She saved 12 lives that night." And with that, silence spread like fog. No more jokes, no more branding comments, no more whispers of just a translator. But no apologies either. That's the part most people never understand. Being proven right doesn't come with a standing ovation. It comes with room temperature coffee and a lounge full of men who now know better, but will never say it. And that's fine. Because I didn't walk in here for recognition. I walked in because it was the only room with decent caffeine and relative quiet. I took my cup and moved toward the window, letting their tension ripple behind me like radio static. Nobody followed. Nobody approached. But they all watched. Every one of them now knew. They might not say it out loud. They might still avoid putting me in the group photo. But they'd think twice the next time someone laughed at the language nerd. They'd remember that when it mattered, when decisions came down to life or death, to translation or detonation, it wasn't their instincts that saved the team. It was mine. And it was recorded whether they liked it or not. I sipped my coffee. Bitter, strong, unapologetic. Just like truth. The envelope was plain. No return address, no seal. Just my name typed neatly across the front, no rank, no title, no code name. Danielle Harlow. I opened it in the quiet of my office, the overhead light flickering slightly above the desk I rarely used for anything personal. Inside was a thin stack of documents, bound with a single metal clasp. My brother's name was all over them. He had been stripped of clearance, revoked from all systems pending formal inquiry. The language was bureaucratic, emotionless. But beneath it I could feel the weight of consequences finally settling where they belonged. He'd tampered with classified translations, misattributed timestamps, copied and pasted summaries that didn't match the original field reports mine. Reports I'd quietly resubmitted months ago, unsigned, routed through a third-party internal channel I'd trusted exactly once. And now it had circled back. I turned the final page and found a small sticky note, square and yellowing, pressed to the bottom corner. It read, "He said something he shouldn't have. Thank you for not staying silent forever." No name, no initials, just that. I stared at it longer than I should have. Part of me wondered who wrote it. A colleague, someone from the translation unit, from internal oversight, or someone who'd been waiting just like I had for someone else to stop pretending not to see. I didn't reply. There was no return path anyway, just the file and its quiet verdict. I folded the documents slowly, carefully, like I was handling something fragile. In a way, I was. It wasn't the punishment that struck me, it was the fact that someone finally acknowledged it. Someone had said it, aloud. Even if not to me directly. The file didn't scream vindication. It didn't erase the years of being invisible in rooms I'd shaped with words no one knew I understood. But it did something else. It proved the silence wasn't permanent. That sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a podium and applause. It shows up in manila folders, in ink on paper, in the absence of access. And that was enough. I walked to the back of the room and opened the safe. It was old manual code, solid build, the kind they'd phased out for digital ones years ago. But I kept it because it reminded me of how things used to be locked away without passwords, just combinations, memory, and patience. Inside were 2 items, a worn leather-bound notebook, filled with transcriptions from my earliest assignments, and a small metal tag. My father's old nameplate, Captain Harlow, polished scratch still heavy with a kind of pride that never quite belonged to me. I slid the folder in next to it, Evan's silence officially broken, stored beside my father's silence, never once breached. It wasn't revenge. I wasn't built for revenge. I was built for accuracy. And now the record was right. I locked the safe and turned the dial. Outside the window, the base was quiet, the desert wind carrying dust like memories. Somewhere across the sand, a younger officer was probably just starting her rotation. Fresh, hopeful, unaware of the languages she'd need to survive that no one teaches in classrooms. I hoped she'd speak them anyway, even if no one asked, even if no one believed her the first time. I sat back in my chair and looked at the empty space above my desk, where others might have hung their medals. I never did. Not out of modesty, but because I'd learned early on that walls don't need reminders of what you've done. The truth has a way of echoing back when it's needed. It always does. The classroom was smaller than I remembered. Rows of seats staggered in half-moon formation faced the whiteboard that never quite erased clean. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above, and the air held that faint chemical trace of dry erase markers and anticipation. It was my first day back as an instructor, not a guest lecturer, not a substitute, officially listed on the faculty roster under linguistic intelligence and operational semantics. Unofficially a whisper that moved faster than clearance levels allowed. On the board I wrote in bold letters, "What turns language into a weapon?" No one spoke for a moment. Some students shifted in their seats. A few looked at me, then back at the question, unsure if it was rhetorical. "It's not fluency," I said, turning back to face them. "It's pattern recognition." 3 ليال مرت ولم يضيء المصباح. من ينتظر الضوء لا يرى الخطى. الأمل ليس في النهار بل في من يوقظ الفجر. إن سكت الماء اصغي إلى الحصى. وإذا خانك الصوت فتحدث بالصمت. Silence. Then pens scribbled. I could tell which ones were listening with ears and which with posture, the way their heads tilted, their spines aligned. I had learned to read these things same as dialects. Postures were regional too. New York cadets sat with a kind of skeptical lean. West Coast ones leaned in like they were trying to hear between words. Words mislead, I said, but rhythm doesn't. I tapped the board lightly. In Ramadi, a single pause before a phrase told us a roadside exchange wasn't about cattle, it was a timed meetup. A few students glanced up. I added, "That moment when meaning hides behind familiarity is when language becomes a weapon." They wrote that down too. One cadet in the second row, sharp eyes, buzz-cut navy pin on the collar, raised his hand tentatively. "Is that why code switching is dangerous?" I nodded. Code switching confuses systems. But what matters more is who's listening and how. I could feel their curiosity deepening, not just as future officers, but as people starting to realize how much of warfare wasn't bullets, it was assumptions. One student in the back had been staring at me since the beginning. Not rudely, just measuring. When I paused between slides, he raised his hand. But his voice when it came was soft. "Ma'am," he asked, "are you really Aquila 7? The room went still. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit between us, heavy, full, unthreatening. Then I smiled. Not a nod, not a confirmation. Just a simple closed-lip smile, the kind you give when you've already said everything worth saying. The students exchanged looks. Some smiled back. No one pushed further. That was the power of names unspoken but known. At the end of class, as the cadets filed out, a few lingered, too polite to ask more, too curious to walk away cleanly. One slid a note across the table before leaving. I used to think translators only listened. Now I realize they decide what others hear. I folded it, tucked it in my coat pocket, and erased the board. What turns language into a weapon? I thought about that again as the last trace of marker faded under my sleeve. The answer hadn't changed. It still wasn't fluency. It was choosing what not to translate. It was timing. It was the art of silence that carried a message louder than a scream. And perhaps that was why Aquila 7 didn't need to speak often. Because when she did, people listened. 3 months after the ceremony, a small envelope arrived at my desk. No return address, no stamps. Just my name in block letters, no rank, no title. Inside was a single photograph. It was old, grainy. The corners had curled from time and heat. But I knew the image instantly. 11-year-old me crouched beside a battered shortwave radio in the corner of my uncle's garage. A worn-out Arabic grammar book sat open beside me, its cover half torn. The radio once used for storm broadcasts crackled faintly in the background, probably picking up stray transmissions from the Mediterranean coast. I remembered that afternoon. It was the first time I'd ever translated something out loud. A man on the other end had spoken in clipped, tired Yemeni Arabic. I couldn't catch much, just fragments, but I sat there for hours scribbling what little I understood. It was nonsense, mostly weather updates and static. But that day, I felt like I had unlocked something ancient. On the back of the photo, in neat cursive, was a message. Some names don't need to be said. They're already remembered. No signature, no indication of who had taken the picture. But I knew it was my uncle who'd snapped that photo. He passed when I was 16. And he had always told me that real names, the ones that mattered, weren't always the ones stamped on IDs. I placed the photo on the desk, then opened the top drawer and pulled out an old sheet of paper folded in thirds. My ROTC scholarship letter. I hadn't looked at it in years. The ink had faded, but the words still rang clear. It was the first official acknowledgement that I had value, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as an individual. A mind. A future. No one in my family had ever commented when I got the letter. No one had celebrated. But I had framed it myself. Back then it sat quietly in my dorm room beside my bed. A small anchor. I unfolded it, now ran my fingers along the edges, and placed it beside the photo, then took both to the bookshelf. There was a frame I'd never used, plain oak, no embellishments. I slid the letter behind the photo, letting only the top of the letter show. The photograph now rested against it, angled toward the window where afternoon light poured in. I didn't add any medals or commendation plaques. Not the Ramadi citation, not the Syria file, not the Al Rila extraction clearance. They were all in my cabinet, locked, sealed, clean. This small memory of a girl with a book and a broken radio meant more than all of them combined. Because she wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't hoping for a ceremony. She just wanted to understand. I turned off the office light and stood in silence for a long while. Not everything that matters is spoken aloud. Sometimes it's in what people choose to send you, or what they remember without prompting. That photograph was never meant to make headlines, but it found its way to me. Just like some truths do, not forced, just arrived. And that day I realized something: I never needed a medal. I just needed someone to finally listen. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry Danielle's story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.